西の国よ、よく聞け。あなたはボックスを開けていない。何の大会も出てない。12段。そんな環境、もともとないではないか。
Today in Japan, it's raining, but these aren't normal raindrops. They are, of course, the tears of your enemy as OP13 rolls around. The meta is so diverse, but then what happened in OP13? All of the results that I see online are just OP13 leaders winning one after another. Now, OP12 with PRB02 is historically one of the most diverse metas that we have ever seen. Compare this with OP13, where we basically only see one of 3 leaders topping every single time. It becomes very, very difficult to play the game if you enjoy that sort of jungle meta. The powerful decks of OP12 simply weren't able to contend with the OP13 leaders, not just due to stylistic differences in the way that the decks play out, as those have always existed in the game, but just due to the sheer amount of resources that some of these decks hold. Therefore, though as much as I want to talk about how all of these OP12 decks will be able to transition into OP13, the fact is that very few of them actually can. I have also written a guide on Black Emu if you decide to play that deck as well. The link is in the description below. It's meant to be more of an encyclopedia for people who want to play Emu if they need very specific things like how to play out a certain turn in the mirror. All that information is within that guide. I spent an exceptionally long amount of time on that, as you can see from my lack of uploads recently. Whether you're a returning player, a new player, or a consistent player, I hope you enjoy this video and you learn something new. From fire red fists to deep ocean blue, sailed Ace, a spirit which few could subdue. Red Blue Ace is the new, most powerful deck in this meta with an asterisk. Red Blue Ace, in simple terms, is a leader that can basically nullify all of the weaknesses of a leader in the One Piece card game. It's a 3-life, 6,000 power leader, which mitigates the weakness of being 3-life by drawing extra cards, and by being able to trash some of those extra cards in your hand to be a 2k counter once per turn. In this way, Red Blue Ace has an exceptionally difficult time bricking in any given game, and has the time given to him to slowly develop his massive board of Whitebeards. If you've played a deck like Red Shanks or Green Bonnie, you'll feel very much at home with the deck like Ace. Ace very consistently can play on curve, and through its curve it can play out some massively powerful cards that it feels like he shouldn't be able to play out because he's not a purple deck. The 8-cost I Am Whitebeard event is very powerful, even more so than you may think. Though the second part of the effect to pick up your life is optional, and you may not actually want to pick it as sometimes your life is more valuable than the plus 2k to your leader, just being able to play out a 10-cost 12,000 power character for 2 dong less feels like you're effectively ramping twice despite not having to ramp at all. This means that the standard purple decks that needed to pay a upfront cost to ramp to eventually get to their powerful cards later on feel completely power crept by this one single event. Ace can play on curve up until 8 dong and still get the benefits of ramping, although he didn't need to. Not only this, but the 10-cost characters that he runs are exceptionally powerful. The new OP13 10-cost Newgate is not only a blocker, not only draws you 2 cards and trashes 1, but also attaches 2 dong to one of your characters as well as your leader, making it so that with this event it basically feels like you played out a 10-cost 12,000 blocker that draws 2 and trashes 1 for only 2 dong. So this card's kind of strong, but that's not the only thing. In fact, actually, I think that one of the most powerful cards within OP13 is the 1-cost Garp. 1-cost Garp is the search event that everyone wanted it to be, and although I did talk about this card in one of my other videos, I want to mention it again as one of the most strong cards that you can pull off of this searcher, especially for Ace, is the 10-cost Roger. Fitting for Ace, I'm sure, but this creates a very difficult scenario for the opponent where it's very difficult to put Ace down to 0 life in general because he has so many powerful blockers as well as so many resources and defensive capabilities, but you also need to be careful of when you do it because if you do it too early, he may kill you with Roger. If you do it too late, you may end up going to 0 life and dying to Roger anyways. Playing against Ace is a very tricky push and pull that the opponent is tasked with dealing with, and the Ace player simply has to stay back, play his 10-cost Whitebeards until he knows that he'll have lethal with his Roger. In this way, Ace, although he has a rather binary playstyle, is very difficult to deal with and is one of the most powerful of the play on curve types of decks that we have ever seen. For people who are more casually playing the game and just want to play it for fun, especially with characters that they really enjoy, I think that Ace is by far the best deck that you can pick, and one that you should absolutely be playing if you just want to win. But as powerful as Ace is, there is of course another leader you have to be worried about, and that is Imu. In shadows veiled beyond all mortal sight stands Imu, the darkness that eclipses the light. Black Imu is the other extremely powerful deck that has power crept so many decks out of OP12 in this OP13 meta. Imu as a deck has a relatively simple seeming playstyle. Saying that Black Imu is an easy deck is like saying Black Yellow Luffy was a very simple deck, because all you had to do was to get to 10 dong, play the 8 cost Moria, play 2 5 costs, and the game's done.
Because Imu's a rather difficult deck and explaining everything about it will be quite long, let's do a bit of an any percent speed run on exactly how this deck functions and how to play this deck, at least at a very basic level. And the best way to talk about Imu is to talk about the strongest card within the deck, the 10 cost Gorose. Now the 10 cost Gorose plays out 5 differing Goroses with differing names that are 5,000 power, to then make a very big board that not only consists of 2 blockers, but also a search as well as ways to increase the power of your board, and also a rush character that reduces the opponent's power. This one card spawns value out of nowhere. Not to mention that this character can actually be played off of the new OP13 stage, the Empty Throne, for only 3 dong. Which means that the best way to play Imu is to just play in a way that mitigates the opponent's aggression. If you just survive until you get to this 10 cost Gorose, then you're in a very good spot into 99% of matchups. The tricky matchups are these decks that can actually contend with you in the later game. In these sorts of matchups, you have to decide if you want to be more aggressive in the early game, or if you do want to actually play these 10 cost Goroses and see if you can out-attrition the opponent. Nonetheless, these decisions, as well as the intricacies of the early game, are what make Imu very difficult, because it's not just the 10 cost Gorose that actually wins you the game, it's the turns that lead up to the 10 cost Gorose, how you actually mitigate the opponent's aggression, how you make your own aggression, how do you build your own board to make it so the opponent has to play in an uncomfortable way to deal with your board. And in this way, Imu is not just a brainless deck that survives until 10 cost Gorose and wins the game, but rather a deck that has very methodical filtering to actively find and make the perfect sequence that'll win them the game. More on that in my guide, link in description once again.
The effective erasure of the OP12 diverse meta that we used to see basically is due to these 2 leaders. Ace on one hand plays massive characters over and over again with exceptionally powerful defensive tools, while Imu does a very similar thing in a completely different way, with his characters not being able to be taken off the board, importantly. In this way, while Ace has some very clear counters like red Black Sabo or any black deck in general, Imu doesn't lose to them. On the other hand, Imu, who loses to a deck like Zoro Sanji, ends up losing to Red-Blue Ace's defensive capabilities. In this way, while you can find decks that can beat one or the other, you're very hard-pressed to find a deck that can beat both at the same time. It's for this reason that the meta has basically devolved into these 2 decks dominating most of it, with other decks coming in that can maybe potentially dodge a couple of these matchups and sneak out wins here and there. Although it's like it never existed, there are still some decks that have survived the apocalypse. Green Zoro is one of these decks, and it is actually the 3rd most represented deck in OP13, at least in Japan. Now, sorry, this leader doesn't deserve a rhyme, and it's not because I don't have time. This leader is very annoying to play against, honestly. I don't really like playing against it, but it is a deck that is crucial to this meta. Now, it's a very simple deck in the way that it wants to play. You simply attach Dong to your leader, and you keep swinging, but it has some more unique tools within OP13. Thanks to the 4-cost Zoro, you can now play out your board and actually use your board as a powerful attacker in the early game without sacrificing too much damage that could potentially come out of your leader, as it restands 2 dong on play. It's a very overstated card, but it's due to this card existing that you can consistently somewhat deal with things like Imu, as if you can manage to play this card out next to things like Koshiro, it's very difficult to actually take back your board, as the character is not only going to be restanding himself every single turn, but also is protected by Koshiro's KO protection. In tandem with the 6-cost law, makes it so that Zoro doesn't just attach Dong to his leader and swing anymore. He can actually expand his board and use that board as relevant attackers in the mid-game. Without this board, you actually can't really beat a deck like Imu, but being able to build up your board, being able to make multiple small attacks makes not only a new way for Zoro to play out the game by chipping away at 5 and 6k like a deck like Rayleigh can potentially do, but also still play in the way that it has always played by putting out these massive swings with the 5-cost Tashigi to be able to swing into the opponent's board and the opponent's leader simultaneously to control the board and the state of the game, to speed up the game to a point that the opponent can't really answer back fast enough. It's for this reason that although decks like Red Rayleigh or Green Purple Luffy have disappeared in the meta as they can only play through the board that they can play out, Zoro has survived, as he can still, of course, use his leader as his greatest offense. The most important card for this deck now is the 3-cost restand event, as without this event, it's very tricky for Zoro to actually break through and end the game. But with this event, you actually have some very surprising plays you can do, whether it's with the Dead Man's Game event or with multiple of these restand events in the same turn to just break through at any cost. This deck has a lot of surprise damage potential that can overcome any of these decks on a good day, but can also lose to any of these decks on a bad day. As it was at the start of OP13, the top 3 decks still haven't changed. However, where before I felt that Green Zoro was almost on par with a deck like Red Blue Ace or Black Emu, I now don't actually believe so. The Emu players have gotten much better at the Ace matchup, and the Ace players have gotten much better at the Zoro matchup. And while Zoro is a deck that was basically being played for its good matchup into Ace, as well as a reasonably decent chance of beating Emu, now that neither of these matchups feel very secure, I feel like the reason to play Green Zoro has somewhat come down. This being said, though, it is still probably the third best deck within the meta, which brings me to the next part of this video, where I am going to show you B-roll footage of my 3v3 tournament, but use this segment more as a way to talk about the OP12 leaders and what happened to them going into OP13. Just to keep you guys updated on some tournament results, our team was Ace, Ima, and Green Zoro, as you would expect. Our Green Zoro went 2-3, Ace also went 2-3, and I went 3-1 and 1. Do not get me started on this double loss. I swear this guy's mind went to Narnia and back with just 2 minutes left on the clock. Jesus Christ. So to start to unravel the mystery of what happened to the leaders in OP12, let's start with one of the most prominent ones currently in Green Purple Luffy. Green Purple Luffy creates massive board advantage by playing these very high value cards such as the 5-cost Sanji and Pudding to not only win out on board but also resources and finish out the game through the 6-cost Secret Rare Luffy. The main reason why this deck died in this meta is because the 5-cost Sanji and Pudding, being base 5-cost, do not actually protect itself with the stage due to the fact that Mars KOs based on original cost. Ani, on the other hand, a deck that's very strong, especially with the new buffs in PRB02, also tends to struggle in the OP13 meta against Ima as well. The reason for this is because while Bonnie can rest one character, if Ima can just get rid of their own characters for a draw, or when they get to Tendong, immediately play 5 to the board, it's very tricky for Bonnie, a late game deck, to actually out late game a deck like Ima. Some Bonnie players have actually been taking in things like the 10-cost Law and Beppo card to be able to make your leader 7,000 power to mitigate at least a little bit of some of this aggression that Ima can put out on these later turns. If Bonnie can avoid Ima, it is still a very, very strong deck, as we can see from this championship that Bonnie actually won. Another deck that you just don't see that much in OP13 anymore is Red Rayleigh. Red Rayleigh was pushed out of the meta more due to Red Blue Ace. Red Blue Ace generally stylistically beats Rayleigh due to the fact that he has so many resources and easy free 2Ks in his kit that makes it very tricky for Rayleigh to actually break through and get to the point that he can even end the game with his unblockable event. Not to mention that although the Ima matchup is better, it's still not very good for him either. Another extremely prominent OP12 leader that has actually survived the OP13 reckoning is Blue Purple Luffy. This leader, especially with the new 8-cost Roger within the deck, makes it so that although you don't have access to things like the 8-cost Katakuri anymore, you can still make yourself very, very tanky should you reach that late game. Being able to play the 9-cost Sanji into the 8-cost Roger to make your leader 8,000 power while being able to leave a Badong for Gum Gum Giant makes the Green Zoro matchup relatively easy now, with your only worry really being Black Emu, as the Ace matchup is also quite good for you as well. I think that Blue Purple Luffy is an honestly underrated deck within this meta, and although that's going to suck for a lot of people who hate fighting against the deck, now that he's not the top meta deck to fight against, he's a lot more interesting and unique to deck build and play. Now, though his current lists do somewhat rely on the 8-cost Roger, I do think that there are some other aggressive versions that you can play with things like the new 8-cost Rayleigh as well. Check out Noel, who was actually able to top an event recently in Southeast Asia with Blue Purple Luffy in this very daunting meta. And with that all being said, let's now return to OP13 and some of the other new leaders that have been quite strong. It's not to the same extent as the top 3. Red Purple Roger is a deck that many may think is underrated and many may think is overrated. But the fact is that this deck is exceptionally powerful, even stronger than Red Blue Ace and Black Ima, if and only if it can draw its curve. When Roger gets to Tendong, he becomes a 7,000 power leader. But the big downside of that is that until he gets to that Tendong turn, he is going to be forced to put one Dong onto his 5,000 power leader every single turn, meaning that at least for the early game, he's going to have to be playing off of curve. Now, this downside is balanced by the fact that many of the OP13 Roger Pirates in purple this set have a simple effect as well as the effect to also ramp you one Dong card. Red Purple Roger has a very specific curve that can go very well when it's going first or second, but if you miss a single piece of this curve, it is devastating. If you can go first and play Buggy on turn 2, Olden or Banque on turn 3, Rayleigh on turn 4, and then on the next turn play out the 10 cost Shanks, then you're in an exceptionally powerful spot into basically any single deck within the meta. If you go second, you can do a very similar thing. On turn 2, you can play Bullet, on turn 3, you can play Gyabang, and on turn 4, you can once again play Rayleigh or the 8 cost Kataguri into the 10 cost Shanks the next turn. Roger, as a deck, lives and dies by his curve. If he misses any single one of these pieces, then his 10 cost Shanks becomes 1 turn late. And this 1 turn is absolutely devastating for a deck like Roger, because that may also entail, depending on the severity and the timing of which he was not able to ramp, not actually become a 7,000 power leader. He needs to become a 7,000 power leader, and he needs to play out these cards like the 10 cost Shanks, like the 8 cost Roger once that promo comes out, and like the 9 cost Newgate when the promo isn't out, to actually be able to contend with many of the leaders within this meta. If he can manage to do this, he is by far one of the strongest decks in this meta because of how quickly he can become 7,000 power with the amount of resources that he has, being a dual color 5 life leader. Now personally, although I am just trying to present these decks to you, I am a bit of a Roger hater because I believe that Roger and Ace are both decks that generally want to play on curve, and while Roger, when he can play on curve, is much more powerful, Ace, if he doesn't play on curve, doesn't immediately lose the game. And for that reason, it's hard for me to honestly recommend this deck to someone who's actually trying to win 9 or 13 rounds in a row at a regional or championship. That being said, for a local or mid-sized tournament, I think that Roger is a great pick as he is very powerful and very easy to use for lots of newer players, while of course also just being the Pirate King. Red Black Sabo is a deck that at the beginning of OP13 seemed to have one of the most promising decks of the entire meta. The existing cards in the 8 cost Dragon and the sheer power of the 6 cost Sabo in OP13 made this deck exceptionally powerful despite the lack of support that it got. It was for this reason that Sabo seemed like he could be one of the few decks that could contend with both Ace as well as Emu. And while this was true for the beginning of OP13, he was slowly phased out as Emu players got much better at the game. The reason for this is because he has a very clear downside within his leader ability. Though he's a dual color 5 life leader, he also is only a 4,000 power leader until he eventually reaches 3 life. In this way, Emu can effectively just starve Sabo until eventually he has a board powerful enough to be able to take back Sabo's board and eventually win the war of attrition. Due to this playstyle from Emu, Sabo was slowly being phased out of the meta, but remained as a powerful meta contender due to the fact that it has a exceptionally good Ace matchup. The reasoning for this is the 9 cost Stussy, and if you have been watching my channel, you have heard about this card way more than you probably need to. 9 cost Stussy just trashes one of your characters and gets rid of one of the opponent's characters. And against a deck like Ace, desperately making their board as big as possible to eventually close out the game with Roger, a card like Stussy that can just control alt delete one of Ace's characters is devastating for this game plan for Ace. It's for this reason that Ace can't necessarily rely on this late game strategy and may need to play more towards the early game against Sabo. But Sabo, having 5 life and having such powerful blockers and board expansion through the 8 cost Dragon and the 6 cost Sabo makes this very difficult. Sabo is a surprisingly powerful deck, and although he doesn't have the same amount of resources as a deck like Ace or Ema does, he has exceptional consistency due to the fact that he has the 1 cost stage, which is a luxury that very few decks have the ability to use. This leader effect, as well as the ability to spread out your board very efficiently, be able to take out the opponent's board with things like Stussy, and eventually line up your board with things that are 8 to 9,000 power, makes this deck surprisingly aggressive and surprisingly powerful for the mid-range deck that it seems to be. And while I would want to leave it at there, a deck that can do rather well into the meta as a whole but generally fails to fight against Emu, that may actually change rather soon. The 4 cost Sabo promo is exceptionally powerful. No longer can Emu just starve out the matchup and whittle away at the opponent's board, because the 4 cost Sabo can come down to grab one of your life, immediately make your leader higher power, and hit on the exact same turn to start the aggression early while developing a very powerful board. It's for that reason that I think that Sabo has very good potential in this OP13 meta for the West that the East didn't necessarily have, due to the fact that we didn't have this promo for a very, very long time. In fact, as of recording this, it has only come out about roughly a week ago, so if we are going to see the events, we are going to start seeing them very soon in championships. Nonetheless though, without this promo, the deck tends to struggle a lot into Emus who know how to play out the matchup, but does very well into Ace regardless, and I think that with this promo, at the very least when you're going second, I think this matchup can potentially even become favored for Sabo, making him a rather good meta contender and a deck worth considering for a regional once that promo comes out. Thank you guys for watching this video. It's been a little while since I've posted, but I was working on my emu guide for an exceptionally long amount of time. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was a bit different, a bit more casual than my usual types of videos, but I hope you enjoyed some of the rhymes here and there. Coincidentally, it has also stopped raining as I was recording this, so that was great for me because I could go to some other locations. It also means that maybe you and your opponents have stopped crying over OP13 as you now know somewhere to start. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, subscribe, all of the general YouTube things, because it does actually help me out. Even if you don't actually use your subscription feed, just hitting subscribe makes me feel a little bit more happy. So if you guys enjoy the content, please let me know. Let me know which OP13 leader you guys will be playing, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.